The trouble began quietly, the way most HOA disputes do. Subtle, creeping, disguised as something too small to worry about. For weeks, there had been a strange tension humming beneath the surface of the neighborhood. It wasn't loud or disruptive, but rather a steady, low-grade irritation that seemed to follow the narrator every time he walked the perimeter of his property. His neighbor, a man notorious in the cul-de-sac for measuring his lawn with the precision of a military drill sergeant, had been lurking around the boundary lines more than usual. He often stood with his hands behind his back, leaning forward slightly as though the grass itself had whispered something suspicious to him. At first, the behavior seemed typical for the man, someone who treated property lines the same way others treat sacred texts. But soon the narrator noticed tools appearing where they didn't belong. A stack of lumber leaning against the neighbor's garage. A set of markers sticking out of the ground like awkward, misplaced gravestones. And then, one morning, the unmistakable sound of hammering echoing through the stillness just after sunrise. The narrator thought nothing of it initially. After all, neighbors built things from time to time. But there was something off about the placement of the noise. It sounded too close. So close that the vibrations seemed to rattle through the narrator's kitchen window. When he finally stepped outside, coffee in hand and curiosity tugging at him, he froze at the sight waiting for him. A fence. A tall, imposing, freshly installed fence standing proudly where his open yard had been the night before. The boards were stiff, clean, and uniform, as though they'd been delivered directly from a lumberyard moments before. But the problem wasn't the fence itself. It was its location. It was not sitting on the shared property line. It was not even a few inches off. It was several feet into the narrator's yard, swallowing a silent slice of land that rightfully belonged to him. Shock washed over him in stages. First disbelief, then irritation, and then the slow, creeping realization that this had not been an accident. The neighbor had not mismeasured. He had not miscalculated. He had built the fence deliberately, confidently, without permission, without discussion, and most infuriatingly, without any attempt to hide what he had done. The neighbor stood proudly beside his creation, admiring it with the kind of smug satisfaction one reserves for personal masterpieces. He surveyed the fence like an artist looking over a completed painting, his posture serene, his expression unreadable. There was no attempt at explanation, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, only a kind of silent assertion, as though the fence had always belonged there and the narrator had simply imagined its absence. The narrator's first instinct was to attempt a rational explanation. Perhaps there had been a misunderstanding or confusion regarding the property lines. But even as the thought formed, he dismissed it. This neighbor had a reputation. He had once filed an HOA complaint because another resident's garden hose temporarily crossed the invisible line dividing their yards. He had measured children's chalk drawings to ensure none crossed his zone of the sidewalk. Misunderstanding was not part of his vocabulary. In the hours that followed, the narrator walked laps around the fence, studying it from every angle. He knew precisely where his property ended because he had examined the plat map when he purchased the home. Nothing about the new structure aligned with those lines. The intrusion was blatant, confident, and irritatingly intentional that he expected the HOA to show up at any moment, summoned by the neighbor's usual eagerness to enforce petty regulations. But strangely, the neighborhood remained quiet. The fence stood unmarred, untouched, an uninvited guest whose very existence declared ownership where there was none. Throughout the day, the narrator mulled over his options. Confrontation would be pointless. The neighbor thrived on conflict. He would turn any discussion into an argument layered in technicalities and twisted reasoning. He had the uncanny ability to turn his own wrongdoing into someone else's fault, a trait that made any direct approach a guaranteed exercise in frustration. So instead, the narrator retreated indoors and began doing what most underestimated homeowners eventually do. He planned. He reviewed his documents, scoured the property records, and revisited the survey map stored neatly in a folder he had barely touched since move-in day. The lines were clear, undeniable, and absolute. The fence, however, stood confidently beyond them, as if mocking the official paperwork with each perfectly aligned board. As dusk settled over the cul-de-sac, the fence cast long shadows across the narrator's lawn. It felt symbolic, an intrusion not only of land but of peace, privacy and personal space. The neighbor had set the first move in motion, and now the narrator found himself compelled to respond. There was no escaping the truth. The situation demanded action. But the narrator was not reckless. Revenge, if taken too soon or too sloppily, could easily backfire. Legality mattered in situations like these. Evidence mattered even more. And so, rather than storming out in a fit of justified anger, he took the quieter, more strategic path. That night, while the neighborhood settled into sleep, he made a list, one that detailed everything he needed to do in order to correct the violation properly and completely. Step 1 was obvious. Get proof, not assumptions. Step 2. Gather support where needed. Step 3. Enforce the truth with precision equal to or surpassing that of the neighbor who had caused all this chaos. By the time he finished outlining his plan, the irritation had transformed into something else: determination. The fence would not stay. His land would not be surrendered. And if the neighbor thought he had claimed victory by erecting an early morning barrier, he was gravely mistaken. The narrator knew exactly what his next step needed to be, and it would begin with a professional, someone capable of cutting through the neighbor's confidence and exposing the indisputable reality of the boundary lines. With that final thought, he closed his notes, satisfied with the plan forming in his mind. Morning would bring clarity, evidence, and the beginning of a process the neighbor would never see coming. The following morning arrived with a clarity that sharpened the narrator's resolve. The fence loomed outside, casting those same long, territorial shadows it had the night before. But instead of irritation, the narrator felt a sense of cold purpose. The neighbor might have acted under the early cover of morning, taking advantage of quiet hours and empty streets, but the narrator had something far stronger on his side: facts. And today he intended to obtain them in a way the neighbor couldn't twist, dismiss, or deny. The first call he made was to a land surveyor, someone licensed, reputable, and thoroughly accustomed to dealing with boundary disputes between feuding neighbors. The narrator explained the situation with the calm maturity of someone who had already processed the shock and replaced it with strategy. The surveyor listened, asked a few clarifying questions, and then scheduled a visit for that very afternoon. The narrator couldn't have asked for better timing. Fate, it seemed, had decided to accompany him in this battle as the day progressed. The cul-de-sac moved through its usual rhythms. Cars left, dogs barked, sprinklers sputtered to life. Through it all, the fence sat unbothered, as though unaware of its impending judgment. The neighbor made several appearances in his yard, casting superior glances toward the narrator's property. He walked up and down the length of the fence, occasionally patting it with a sense of pride that bordered on theatrical. The narrator observed quietly. Patience mattered. Any premature move would only embolden the neighbor further. When the surveyor finally arrived, his truck rolling steadily into the driveway, the narrator felt a wave of satisfaction wash over him. The man stepped out, clipboard in hand, expression serious and focused. He examined the property documents the narrator provided, looking over the plat map, the deed, and the historical markers recorded years prior. After a few minutes of silent assessment, he gathered his tools and headed into the yard to begin the meticulous process of determining the true boundary. The surveyor worked with an efficiency that was almost artful. He placed stakes with precision, measured distances with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this task countless times, and made careful notes that captured every detail. Each step, each placement, each line drawn in the soil felt like another blow against the neighbor's carefully constructed illusion of ownership. The neighbor noticed the activity within minutes. His reaction was instantaneous. He emerged from his home with the urgency of a man who believed his authority was being challenged. He hovered at the edge of his own yard, arms crossed tightly as he watched the surveyor's movements. Although he said nothing, his posture conveyed everything: suspicion, annoyance, and an unmistakable sense of entitlement. He paced, circled, and glared, as though the surveyor's equipment were invading his very soul. But the surveyor remained professional, unaffected by the silent hostility radiating nearby. He followed the measurements with unwavering focus, marking spots that gradually formed a clear, undeniable line across the property. And with each new marker driven into the ground, the narrator began to see something extraordinary. The fence was not merely a few inches or even 1 foot into his property. It was significantly over the boundary, multiple feet, as though the neighbor had intentionally scooped up a generous slice of land for himself. The surveyor finished his work methodically, checking and rechecking the numbers to ensure accuracy. When the final marker was placed, the boundary line stood revealed in a neat, uncompromising row of stakes. The truth was visible to any observer. The fence intruded well into the narrator's property. The neighbor stood rigid, jaw clenched, his earlier confidence evaporating into an uncomfortable tension. He had expected a simple disagreement that could be dismissed or twisted into a gray area. Instead, he found himself facing irrefutable evidence measured and documented by a licensed professional with no stake in the conflict. The surveyor returned to the narrator with a calm, steady tone, explaining the results with clarity and certainty. The fence was absolutely on the wrong side. There was no ambiguity. No misinterpretation. No room for debate. The surveyor would prepare a full written report, complete with diagrams and legal descriptions. It would hold up against any accusation, challenge, or false claim. The narrator thanked him, feeling a deep, pulsing satisfaction that warmed him from within as the surveyor packed up his tools and left. The neighbor hovered in the distance, pretending to busy himself with small tasks but clearly shaken. The narrator did not approach him. There was no need. The evidence was not meant for discussion. It was meant for action. With the surveyor's report pending, the narrator shifted his focus to the next phase of his plan. Documentation was critical in HOA-related disputes, and he knew better than to leave anything unrecorded. He took photographs of the survey stakes from every angle, ensuring that each one captured the exact placement relative to the fence. He recorded a video walkthrough of the yard, narrating the visible discrepancies in calm, objective terms. He even captured footage of the fence's construction quality, something that would later matter far more than he realized as evening approached. The neighborhood lights gradually flickered to life. The fence, once a source of frustration, now stood as a monument to the neighbor's overreach, destined to become the centerpiece of his undoing. The narrator felt a strange sense of peace knowing that the truth was no longer a matter of opinion but of measurement. The neighbor, meanwhile, grew restless. He paced along the fence repeatedly, sometimes bending down to inspect the survey stakes as though hoping they might magically realign themselves in his favor. But numbers do not bend to personal preference, and boundaries do not shift simply because someone wishes them to. The narrator watched quietly as the neighbor's agitation fermented into something resembling panic. Night settled over the cul-de-sac once again. But this time, the stillness carried a different tone. The narrator's yard was no longer a battleground of uncertainty. It was the scene of an impending correction, one backed by legal documentation, professional evaluation, and indisputable truth. As he closed the curtains and prepared for sleep, the narrator felt the weight of the coming confrontation. The surveyor's report would be ready soon. Once in hand, it would be time for the next step, an official notice that the fence must be removed and the land restored to its rightful owner. The neighbor had drawn the first line without permission, without honesty, and without respect. Now, the narrator would draw the second one, with precision, legality, and unshakable confidence. The day of the neighborhood presentation arrived, a crisp Saturday morning that seemed ordinary to anyone driving through Brookside Heights. Lawns gleamed in the sunlight, children played on sidewalks, and the familiar hum of suburban life went on uninterrupted. But inside the community center, tension crackled like static electricity. Residents packed the room, murmuring with anticipation, while the HOA board arrived confident, almost smug, that they would assert control and quell any questions from the gnome agitator. Marilyn walked in quietly, her demeanor calm and unassuming, but her mind was razor-sharp, every step choreographed for maximum effect. She had prepared a detailed slideshow, complete with photographs, scanned letters, meeting minutes, and carefully highlighted bylaws. Every element of her argument had been double-checked, cross-referenced, and verified. This wasn't just a presentation. It was a carefully constructed revelation designed to expose the HOA's hypocrisy, overreach, and incompetence. As the meeting began, the board launched into their routine recitation of rules and regulations, emphasizing uniformity, compliance, and the importance of maintaining community standards. Their words, intended to intimidate, fell flat. Residents were already aware of Marilyn's meticulous documentation, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd every time a board member claimed authority without evidence. Marilyn stepped forward. Her voice was steady, her tone polite, almost disarming. She began with a simple premise. This meeting is about fairness and transparency in our community governance. Then, slide by slide, she laid out the evidence. She highlighted the fine over her 3 gnomes, juxtaposed against contradictory rulings on other residents' decorations. She presented emails where board members had failed to cite proper bylaws or had misapplied rules entirely. She revealed inconsistencies in meeting minutes, documented threats that lacked legal authority, and examples of favoritism toward certain homeowners. The room fell silent. Each piece of evidence was small on its own, but together they formed a picture that could not be ignored. The HOA was overstepping its power, enforcing rules arbitrarily, and acting without accountability. Residents shifted uncomfortably as they realized how often they themselves had been subjected to minor fines or warnings that had never been challenged. Marilyn didn't raise her voice, didn't resort to theatrics. She simply presented the truth with clarity and precision, letting the facts speak louder than any outburst could be. By the time she reached the section of her presentation detailing the gnomes, laughter and applause began to ripple through the room. Her 3 small figurines, once the cause of her punishment, were now a symbol of reason, resilience, and clever rebellion. Each slide emphasized how petty enforcement could alienate residents and erode trust in leadership. The irony was not lost on anyone. The very tiny ornaments the board had ridiculed had sparked a movement, exposing the flaws in a system that prided itself on order. The HOA board scrambled. Members whispered urgently to each other, trying to maintain control, trying to justify the unjustifiable. But every excuse Marilyn had anticipated, every feeble argument, had already been addressed and dismantled in her documentation. When a board member attempted to challenge a claim, Marilyn calmly cited the corresponding meeting minutes or email chain, leaving them flustered and visibly red-faced. The room erupted in quiet murmurs and nods of approval with every precise rebuttal she offered. Residents began sharing their own stories. They recounted fines for mailboxes painted slightly off-color, flags displayed for a single holiday, or shrubs pruned improperly. Each anecdote amplified the case Marilyn had meticulously prepared. The board had no choice but to listen, powerless to counter the wave of evidence and public scrutiny. The very authority they had relied upon for years now crumbled in real time, and every eye in the room was aware of it. Marilyn's final slide was simple. A photograph of the 3 gnomes, standing proudly among her flowers, captioned, "Small acts can expose large injustices." The applause was immediate, heartfelt, and sustained. Residents clapped, cheered, and even laughed at the absurdity that had started this saga. The once feared HOA board sat frozen, their faces flushed with embarrassment, caught in a moment they could neither deny nor recover from. After the presentation, the aftermath unfolded swiftly. The board quietly voted to rescind the fine, not only for Marilyn but retroactively for other minor violations that had been improperly enforced. They issued an official apology, acknowledging procedural errors and promising greater transparency. Though no one expected them to admit fully how badly they had been outmaneuvered. Marilyn, however, had achieved more than a simple victory. She had shifted the balance of power in Brookside Heights, proving that diligence, preparation, and courage could topple the most rigid authority. The neighborhood buzzed with excitement for weeks afterward. Residents shared screenshots of Marilyn's presentation, retold the story of the gnomes, and celebrated the subtle revolution she had orchestrated. Lawn decorations became more creative, garden ornaments more daring, and for the first time in years, residents questioned unnecessary fines with confidence. Marilyn's quiet, methodical rebellion had inspired others to stand up, proving that a single act of clever defiance could ripple through an entire community. As for Marilyn, she returned to her home, the gnomes still proudly displayed, and felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She hadn't needed confrontation, yelling, or chaos. Her revenge had been precise, strategic, and utterly satisfying. The HOA, once feared and untouchable, had been humbled not by anger, but by persistence, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to fairness. Brookside Heights would never be quite the same. The gnomes, once tiny symbols of whimsy, now stood as sentinels of a new era, proof that even the smallest act of defiance could spark change, that justice could prevail against petty authority, and that careful, deliberate strategy could turn an absurd fine into a legendary victory. The HOA, meanwhile, would remember this day for the rest of their tenure. Not as a tale of authority and compliance, but as the day a quiet, clever resident with 3 gnomes showed them exactly who was really in charge.